Hello and welcome back to our latest Find My Past live webinar. As always, thank you very much for joining us. This week I'm joined by the author, family historian and census expert John Hanson, who has kindly offered to give today's fascinating talk on understanding the censuses of England and Wales. Census records, as a lot of you will be aware, are incredibly important. They're very useful and they'll often be your first port of call. They provide you a snapshot of family life, they can help you jump back through the generations, and also they can place individuals into more meaningful context, their families and their neighbours, and the wider framework of their local and social surroundings, so they're really, really useful documents. Over the next 40 minutes or so, John will be covering some of the fundamental aspects of using census records. He'll be looking at the fascinating history behind them, explaining some of the changes they've underwent over the years, and highlighting some of the reasons why your ancestor might appear to be missing. As per usual, we will have a team of experts on hand who are going to try their best to answer questions throughout, so pop any you may have in the box on the left of the screen, and they will try their best to get through as many as possible. Also, depending on how we do for time, John might be able to answer a few questions in person at the end of his talk. So thanks very much again for tuning in. We hope you enjoy it and come away feeling inspired to revisit census records. Please let us know if any of the tips you pick up today help you smash down any of those frustrating brick walls. You can send your discoveries through to testimonials at findmypast.co.uk. So that's enough for me, and I will now hand you over to John. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Alec. Good afternoon, everybody. My belief has always been that if you want to try and understand something, you really need to go back to the fundamentals and really get to grips with the reason that records were created and why. So what I want to try and do this afternoon is to do the same thing for you with the census. So first of all, it's history. First census, in fact, was actually taken in 1801 and has been taken every 10 years since, with the exception of 1941. The pre-1841 censuses are very few and far between in what actually survives, and they're very spasmodic. You can't predict exactly what's going to survive. And the other thing with most of them they were what was termed as a head of household, an account of the number of people. So you're not going to get a great deal of family information. There is a publication, or there was many years ago, that listed what was available. There's about 800 pieces surviving for the years from 1801 and right through to 1831. And it was always taken on a Sunday. The reason, of course, the census being taken on the Sunday was the one day that most people were actually home from work. First census, as we said, was in 1841. It's the unusual one in some ways because it was actually taken in the middle of the year. It was taken on the 6th of June. It should have been actually at the same time as the rest of them, but it was delayed for some reason or other nobody's particularly sure of now. It's of limited use, to my mind, because it only contains the names, obviously, but it only has the first given name. It doesn't have more than one. It has the age, which is 9 times out of 10 rounded to the nearest 5 years down for anyone over the age of 15. The one thing you need to look at is look at the whole of the page. If you find ages that are in 23 or 33, then he's one of the enumerators that sort of bucked the trend, if you want, and has basically listed everyone properly. No relationships, so you have to be very careful what you imply. What you might think as being a married couple could in fact be brother and sister. And the place of birth is purely and simply limited to within the county or out. The exceptions are, you will find a code letter occasionally that says S, which means they were born in Scotland, I means they were born in Ireland, and F means they were born in foreign parts. And the occupation only tends to exist for the head of the household, unless it's a servant, and they're normally dictated as being either MS or FS, for obviously male or female servants. But the other thing, of course, you need to think about is, was the servant actually a member of the family, or the extended family? I've lost a slide.
Ah, we can go back, no worries.
No, it's missing.
Oh, it's missing.
Come back. No, this 51 is missing. Right, I'll have to tell you the 51 off the top of my head.
Sorry about that, guys. That's the thing about live, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, it's live. They missed one of my slides when they converted it. The 1851 census was taken 2nd of April, I think, from memory. It was the first one, of course, that introduced all of the information that we really need as a family historian. So it introduced second Christian names on a lot of people. It introduced marital status. It introduced the relationship to the head of the household. And it introduced full place of birth, which is supposed to be recorded as the parish and the county. And for those overseas, it was purely and simply supposed to be the country. But of course, like all things, it's down to the individual enumerator as to how good they were. And it included disabilities as well on the end, which was either deaf, dumb or blind. 1861 is basically the same as 51. The big problem with 1861 is it's probably the worst one in terms of quality. There's lots of odd missing pages in 61, as we'll find later on. And of course, there's a number of completely missing pages. Oh, there's the 51.
Oh, we found it.
It's gone out of order. See if I got it right. Oh, yes, full address was the other one. It gives you the full address. The other thing to mention about addresses is that once you get into villages, of course, you end up with a situation where it might just say High Street. Don't make the mistake that a lot of people have done in the past of including the schedule number as being the house number. A lot of people actually get the two confused. Oh yes, the other one is that it included as well in 51 whether the person was a master, a joiner or an apprentice. So 1871 was taken on the 2nd of April. Basically, again, the same as 51 and 61. It saw the introduction of the disability column itself in its own right, where it indicated whether a person was a lunatic, an imbecile, or an idiot. I'm sure you probably know that about your ancestor if they were. 1881, basically the same as 71. But the interesting one with this is it was both Find My Past and Ancestry used the self-same index because they used the one that was actually created by the LDS Church in the first place. 1891, basically the same as 81 again. It recorded whether a person was an employer or an employee. One of those lovely little facts that can suddenly make a difference as to what you think about your ancestors. The other thing that's recorded on there that a lot of people actually miss is the column that says the number of rooms occupied if the family occupied less than 5.
Sorry guys.
We go 1901, taken on the 31st of March. Basically the same as 1891. Recorded for the first time whether somebody worked at home or not, which again can be quite useful to know. Now 4 categories of disability. You can either be deaf and dumb, blind, a lunatic, or an imbecile or feeble-minded. And then, of course, the last one, which is currently available, which is the 1911, taken on the 2nd of April. Radically different, of course, because it's the one where, in fact, the schedules were retained and there is no actual enumeration book, the same as we were used to seeing in the past. It creates its own problems because whereas in the past you might have had 30,000 different sets of handwriting, in this case now you've got about 8.5 million. And no two people ever wrote the same. It was also, because it was different, it was, you've got to think whether your ancestor could actually read and write and could read the form. It's a lot. If you actually look at a blank copy, the back of it is extremely detailed about what should and shouldn't be put in. And I'm fairly certain there was a lot of misunderstanding about what was actually required. However, it does have its benefits. Because occasionally you will find listed deceased children. If it's turned around and says that a family should have 5 children and there's 5 listed, but you know that one of them had died, then you've actually got the names of all the children. Doesn't always occur in every family, but it can be useful if it does crop up. The other thing, of course, is that because we're seeing the original schedule, you see all the crossings out and the rest of it that were made, that the enumerator probably wouldn't have copied into his book if he was going to copy them in at all. So again, that can be quite useful. The usual one actually that crops up with that one is the one that normally was on married women, where they were supposed to list their how many years they'd been married and the rest of it. And quite often, if they were a widow, they'd put it down, and the enumerator would basically just cross it out. The original copies of the census are at the National Archives, but they're not consultable, unfortunately, as much as we would all like to try and get hold of the originals. There's usually copies in the local record office. In fact, most of them, I think, these days will probably point you straight at a PC. And, of course, they're all available on the internet, and, of course, you can do everything on the internet, can't you? Okay, production process. What would have happened was that the enumerator would have gone out normally a few days beforehand and given every householder a copy of the schedule and asked them to fill it in. The question is, who filled it in? Because quite often I suspect it wasn't going to be your actual ancestor, depending upon whether they could read or write. It was more likely to be a neighbour or somebody who filled it in. And the worst comes to the worst, if the enumerator came round at the end of the day on the Monday morning following the census to pick up the form and it hadn't been completed, he'd probably end up filling it in himself. They were then copied. It was the enumerator's job to copy the schedules in numerical order into his enumeration book. And then, in theory, the schedules were all destroyed. Which, of course, means that we've got no way of proving what was in the book. With 1901, where am I? Oh, yeah. In terms of the schedules or the enumeration books, they were bound together into with a number of books, normally 5 or 6, into what was known as a piece. In 1841, they were organised by 100 rather than anything else. And they were then foliated in the top right-hand corner of the bound books. And they were referenced in 1841 by piece number, book number, folio, and page number. The folios, of course, being only on the right-hand page. In 1851 to 1901, again, they were bound together into a piece, normally about 5, I think, from memory. Foliated top right-hand corner again, and they're referenced purely and simply by piece, folio, and page. At the beginning of every book, up to and including 1901, there were a series of additional pages, which are, the two of which are particularly useful are the statistics page and the Enumerators Walk. The statistical page, everyone wonders why on earth it's useful. It's useful if you've got a book where you think there's pages missing, because you can tell from the statistics page there could have been 33 pages, and when you look at the actual transcript it says there's only 29. So you can actually say, yes, I've got 2 pages missing. This is a typical page from 1841. It's actually probably better than most because you can actually read it. Some of them, in fact, are very faint. They were written, I believe, the originals in pencil on brown paper, and not a very good quality paper either. The later ones, I picked one from 1891 purely and simply as one to be able to try and show. Actually, if I go back just a second. The one thing, of course, is all the crossings out. Everyone wonders why on earth they're there. They were actually put on there by the checkers who were going through, or the collators who were going through collecting the statistics about how old somebody was or what their occupation was. And the reason for putting the mark in there is purely and simply so they knew what had been done and what hadn't been done. If you've already recorded the piece value and page number, you can actually go and use the Find My Past website by looking in the individual census year to actually look up that specific reference itself. And if we do that on this one, then you get the transcript of the number of people, and we can then go on and actually look at the image itself. Oh yeah. So down on the bottom, you've got the piece number. They do vary. Some are on the bottom, some are on the side. It varies from census to census. This one says it's RG9, so you know it's 1861. And up on the top corner, you've got the folio number, which is the heavy number above the box, and the page numbers on the top there as well. Statistics page, as I said earlier, explains how many males and how many females there were on every page. And then we come to the Enumerators Walk, and they do vary. You'll get some that will purely and simply say, you know, the whole of the village, and others will actually detail every single street. (1911), of course, is totally different, as we said earlier. Each enumerated area was a separate piece number, so we end up with about 5 times the number of piece numbers as a normal census, and there's about 32,000, I think, from memory. Schedule numbers were allocated when the schedules went out, and that's actually written on top of every schedule. The Enumerators Walks actually are in a separate series, which is RG78 rather than RG14. Whilst in fact it's believed that most of the census survives, there's a number of pieces from RG78, the Enumerators Walks, that are totally missing. Lincolnshire, I think from memory, is probably the worst of all of them. This is actually the census return for my grandfather when he was living. He moved up from the Gloucestershire area up to London, and I use it for a number of reasons. The entry that's crossed out is not somebody that's died. In fact, it's one of his brothers who was actually off living with an uncle I found later. But interestingly, Ebor on there that's listed as being a boarder is actually Francis, the head of the household's brother, and Ellen, who's listed as a visitor, is actually his sister. So relationships don't always necessarily count. The other thing that was always interesting with this one was that, of course, it has the fact there that there were 2 missing children, which tied in with something my grandfather had always said. And when you get to 97, you do begin to wonder whether they're actually believing things or not. So it was nice to actually find out that he was actually correct in what he'd said. And I've actually now, subsequently, very recently, managed to find out exactly who the other 2 children were. On the other side of on the right-hand side of the page, you've got the occupations and places, and you'll notice there's numbers actually on both of them. The ones in blue or green are the occupation codes, which were actually used by the collators to actually put straight into the accounting machines when they collated all the information. And the same thing happened with place of birth. They were collated into codes. If down on the bottom of the screen, you've got a box that a link that will come up, which will give you the ability to go and look at the statistical pages and the rest of it. And the interesting one out of those is what's called the list. And this actually lists the head of the household for every single household that is on the schedule. But not only did they list all of the actual places, but even if a property was empty, you'll find it's actually listed as well. So it's I solved a problem for somebody once when there were two families with the same name in the same village, and he knew which family lived next door to the stables, and we managed to find which one of the 2 families it was because the stables themselves were actually listed. And this image actually shows you the front of the schedule. So in fact, when it was handed to him, in this case to Francis, it had his name and his address on the front of the schedule, so he knew exactly who he was giving it to. In terms of what's online, with the census, as we said earlier, all of 1841 to 1911 is available online on Find My Past. Each has its own indexing issues, and we'll come on to those later. And in fact, there is no such thing as a perfect index. You try as much as you can, you will never make it 100% perfect. When I used to run family history groups many years ago, one of the things I used to do probably every couple of years is to give everyone in the group a copy of a census page, and we'd all do the same one and get everyone to transcribe it. And then we'd compare the results afterwards. No two were ever the same, and everyone vowed afterwards they would never actually transcribe a census again. It's worth reading the help on the website. Normally, if you're looking at a specific census return, you'll normally find the help is listed underneath underneath the search screen. And there is actually a complete list on the Find My Past website of the known missing complete pieces, which is different to missing pages, but we'll come to that one later. It's also worth checking out the street indexes. They're at the National Archive. They're all available now on their website. They've actually redone them all. Anyone who remembers the old days of going to the Family Record Centre in London will remember the street indexes. Extremely useful if you're trying to isolate a particular street. Didn't help me because I had an ancestor who lived in Commercial Road. I didn't know the street number, and in fact that particular piece in the old days would have been a nightmare to research because it was on 27 pieces on 8 different rolls of microfilm. With Find My Past, it's the only website that offers you an address search for every single year. And there's several different ways that you can access it. And you can also, as we've said before, use the quick search. You can, of course, do just a global search and then go and pick the census entries out of it. But in fact, what we can also do is using the search one, there's 2 options. We can go and look at the census, which is much more of a general one, or you can go and look at the A to Z index, which will bring up the list of what's available year by year, and you can go and find the individual census return that you want to go and use. With the census address search, in this case I've used the one from 1911, and I've put in here, oh no, we've gone back. Yes, I knew there was something else I was going to cover first. If you're looking at general search on the census, the one thing you can do is that by using the general search, you can actually specify more than 1 year, and they don't have to be consecutive years. So you could go and search for just 51 and 71, or 81 and 91, or whatever. That's the result from having done that particular one. With the address search, with this particular one, I've purely and simply gone and looked for any street that starts with the word Brook in Preston. And the result that you get back lists every single street name, whether it be Brook Road, Brook Lane, Brookhead Lane, or whatever. Pick the one that you're interested in, and you'll then get a complete list of both the schedule numbers and the household numbers. And you scroll down it until you find the one you want, and then you can actually go and look at the individual transcript for that particular household. Scotland and Ireland. Scotland, of course, survives for the whole of the period, 1841 right through to 1911. It's all available on Scotland's People. The transcripts are all available as well on Find My Past, but the images are not available. Oh, you've got those as well now?
Yes, we do.
Oh, right. I haven't had any Scottish ones to go and do recently. And the other thing that's different slightly with the Scottish one is that the...
Oh, no, sorry, no.
Alex, wrong.
Apologies, guys.
All the schedule copies were copied into enumeration books, so you don't actually end up with the original schedules in Scotland. With Ireland, only 1901 and 1911 survive, and they're both available on Find My Past and also on the National Archives of Ireland. Future censuses, 1921. The one, of course, all of us, I would suppose, would like to get their hands on. It won't be released before 1922, and in fact, I heard recently that because of the 100 years rule, what they're going to do is whereas in the past the images have been available to people like Find My Past, so they can actually get the transcript out and get it ready to be released on the beginning of in this case 2022, the actual images aren't going to be available until 2022, so then you've got to start the process of transcription and the rest of it afterwards. And it's all due to the 1920 Census Act, which actually says it's locked away for 100 years. 1931, we have a problem because it was actually destroyed by fire in the Second World War. 1941, of course, doesn't survive because there wasn't one. But, of course, we do now have the 1939 register that's available, and again, exclusively on Find My Past. 1951, will any of us be around to see it? I have this perverse wish. I want to see myself on the census. Mind you, if I get to that time, I'll be 104, and I'm not sure whether I'll still be involved in family history. So problems with the census. We'll look at these very specifically, very briefly to begin with. So the first one is obviously phonetic spelling. A lot of spelling will have been done phonetically, so it's what people thought they heard. We had the problem in 1841 of ages being rounded down to the nearest 5 years. You have missing entries. You know, we'll come on to those in a moment. The other question, of course, to ask yourself is, am I looking in the right place? Were they where you thought they should be? There's a family in my wife's family that were born in Edmonton in North London, died in Edmonton in North London, but in 1911 they're living up in South Shields in County Durham. Exactly why, I have no idea. The other thing, of course, is, have you tried searching for the address if you know where they are? If they're on the same address year after year, then it's worth always double-checking that one. If you've got a child that's born near to a census year, check the address that's on the certificate. Okay, now let's go and have some fun about trying to find out where you can't find your ancestors. The first one is that they're not in the country. Well, not in the country or not at home, let's put it that way. It could be that the page is either missing or damaged. It could be that somebody actually didn't provide the information in the first place, and if you failed to provide information, even as it is now, you could still be fined or taken to court and fined. We have as well, there's an interesting series of errors which are actually called enumeration errors. This is one that you can't actually correct because the error was actually made by the enumerator when he was transcribing it and not by the people actually doing the indexing. And then, of course, we have indexing errors. And then we have a thing at the end we'll throw in called quality matters. All right, not in the country or not at home. When I went searching for my grandmother's family, her sister Elsie wasn't actually with the family. So I just went and thought, all right, let's go and see if we can find Elsie. And we will go looking for an Elsie Bird, born in Suffolk, and born about 1891, I think she was. And interestingly, everyone says to me, but you're going to get hundreds of them. No, you don't. There's not that many, actually. I think there's about 6. And I knew she was going to be in North London anyway. And there she was, in fact. She's actually living in Edmonton, somewhere away from the rest of the family. But if you actually go and look at the image, she's actually living with her uncle, called John Smith. Yes, my great-great-grandfather was John Smith. So I'm probably related to all of you. There we are, we've blown it up so it's a bit easier to see. The other one with this one is, in fact, that he's not actually living with his wife. His wife had died, I think, the year before, and he's actually living with his sister. So if you hadn't looked at the image or looked at the transcript carefully, you might have thought that they were husband and wife, and in fact they're not. Not at home, of course. The other problem, of course, is we get what we call the armed forces. So if your ancestor was in the army, if he's at home, that's not a problem. If he's in barracks in this country within the UK, then he will obviously be included. The problem is the army soldiers serving overseas. And the first census return where they are actually included is the 1911 census. But again, that only really applies if they're in the barracks. If they're off in the middle of the town, are they going to be included or not? The Royal Navy, certainly from 1861 onwards, the Royal Naval ships are classed as part of the British mainland, and normally they will be listed on the census returns. The earlier ones, 1851, there seems to be some doubt as to whether they're included or not. And the later ones, again, it's the usual problem. If they're on board ship, they're fine. If they're in port and they're off on shore leave, then you're not going to find them. Merchant Navy is an even bigger problem. If you've got merchant navy ancestors, they can be a pain to resolve anyway. But certainly with the merchant navy, what would have happened was that the enumerator would have gone round and said to the captain of the ship, when are you going to be coming into port next? And if it was going to be more than a couple of weeks, then he'd have been told, oh, well, basically don't bother. And if they were coming back into port, then he'd been given the form and said, hand it in when you come into port. But of course, he may have left London and gone into Hull or somewhere, in which case you'll find the returns in Hull and not in London. And of course, the biggest problem in 1911 is actually not the men, it's actually the women. It's this lovely group of women called the suffragettes. Nobody knows exactly how many are missing. The figures are reputed to be somewhere probably between 15 and 20,000. So if you think your ancestor was a suffragette, then you may be one of those of interest. Damaged and missing pages. Would anyone who does transcription want to try and actually transcribe that one? The ink's obviously been spilled over the page sometime after it was completed, because otherwise the enumerator would have just crossed it out and actually written it on the next page. And it's one of those interesting ones that if anyone watches the likes of CSI these days, they'd have had it scanned and sort of digitized and sort of done within minutes. Or you've got ones like this one, and it's this is part of the one-name study I do on the Holsteads, and the columns that are missing, in fact, are the relationship and the age column. So I know who it is, but I've got no idea what their relationship is. We talked earlier about missing pages. This is actually from 1861, where in fact the entire Belgravia sub-district is missing. They know the statistic from the statistics that there's 55,000 people. It was always thought it was because the Queen was in Buckingham Palace and didn't want to be included. It's nothing to do with that at all. She was actually down on the Isle of Wight that year. And then down the bottom here, you'll find missing streets or part missing streets. And the bottom one there says that numbers 1 to 12 exist, but from number 13 onwards doesn't. A failure to provide information. This one I actually found on the walls at the Family Record Centre many years ago. And it relates to a household from 1841, and it's actually recorded in the schedules itself. And it says, John Travers will not give away any information respecting the persons who abide with his house other than the number 12 males and 5 females. And it then goes on to say that he was actually fined £5 for his sins. I just hope they paid him well enough. Enumeration errors. These are the errors, as I've said before, where the error has been caused by the enumerator getting it wrong. This particular one belongs to an old friend of mine, and it was only when she was looking for her grandfather and couldn't find him, and it was only when she went through later looking for the sort of grandchildren of some of the other families, she suddenly came across it, and she suddenly realised that in fact the address that the couple were in, and this is Robert Attersley down the bottom, the house in fact is where they were married from, and in fact it was also the address that the daughter was born at, but in fact Robert isn't Robert, he's actually Reuben. Rebecca isn't Rebecca, she's Ruth, and Rachel, the daughter, is in fact not Rachel, she's Rosa. Now the interesting thing is, was it the enumerator who got it wrong, or was it the mother-in-law, in fact, who they were living with? No one will know, but it's one of those that you cannot correct. It's correctly transcribed by Find My Past, but the error isn't theirs. We come on to indexing errors. Now, these are obviously the errors that crop up from time to time. Somebody said to me the other day, but why have I got all my examples in here that are not from Find My Past? Because I can't put them on from Find My Past, because all the ones in Find My Past have actually been corrected. This particular one goes back to the original 1901 census. Was my great-grandfather, Frederick Noyce. He doesn't appear in the indexes. His father, in fact, is the person who got me lecturing nearly 20 years ago when it first came out. And Frederick, in fact, what I've done here is one of the ways that you can find people if they're missing. Search for the Christian name and forget the surname. So what we've done is look for every Fred. It's a little easier to do variants now than it was in those days. So I'm looking for a Frederick who's male, born about 1871, in Peckham, in London. Everyone says, you're going to get hundreds of them. Yes, you'll get about 60 or 70. But you don't have to go looking at every single household. because all you're doing is looking down the list of names. And if we blow this one up a little bit, I was going through searching down this list, looking for something that looked like Noyce. So, you're not looking for the long names, you're looking for the short ones. And I suddenly found one that said Frederick Noyce. Now, N's and R's don't normally get mistranscribed. They're not sort of two letters you would normally mix up. But in fact, if we go and look at the image on this particular one, which is what I did, and then when I went and had a look at it, I thought that and Frederick's up on the top there, and it could be an N or it could be an R. But if you look at the R that's in he's got two children actually with an R. We've got Roland and Richard, in fact, in the next household. So you could argue whether, yes, it could be a badly written R, but if you actually look down the bottom of the page, you've got New Brompton. And there's normally another entry on the page somewhere that's going to have the self-same letter that you can actually compare. So that's the first type of error that we're going to be looking at. The other one, of course, is that, and I've seen this all too often these days, people have a search screen and they think just because they've got all these fields, they have to fill them all in. Now, in my working life, before I retired, I used to program for a living. And of course, the one thing that everyone does with computers is they put as much information in as they can, which is in fact the wrong thing to do, because the more you put in, the more you actually have to match completely. And therefore, the greater the chances you're not actually going to find what you want. What you really want to do is put in as little information as possible. So with this one, we can actually not go and find our George Adams in Utoxeter. And we can put actually a bit less information in, but he still doesn't exist. There certainly is not a George Adams in that list of results. So the logical thing is we throw away the surname. And in fact, that didn't resolve anything because there were no Georges that fitted. So what I did was something I don't normally do, and I went and looked for purely and simply the surname. So we went and looked for Adams. And there he is, sitting in the middle. And he's not George, he's Geroge. Yes, Geroge. Look at the image, and it's understandable where they got Geroge from. Interestingly, when I found this one, I actually reported. I did at the time find 700 of them from my past, actually. And I actually wrote to one of the senior people at the time. This is about 10 years ago. And in fact, what they did was they actually put Geroge in the list of variants. So one of the reasons why you should always use the list of variants. And in fact, even last year, I found another whole series of them, which is all the names that start AL, which was actually mistranscribed as LA at the beginning. So they still crop up from time to time. Wrong ages. We talked earlier about check marks, and one of the problems that occurs occasionally is that people can confuse the check mark for being an age. And in fact, what we end up with here is two people who are, she's actually listed, yeah, she's on there. So Betty's listed as the head of the household. Her daughter, or her niece Hannah, who's actually 6, was indexed originally as 61. So therefore, you end up with a niece who's actually older than the head of the household. So that's one of them, one of those sort of problems. I mean, where do you want to go and put this one if you're doing the indexing? It says down the bottom there, Sarah Halstead, age, not known, say 30. So was it the fact she looked 30? Did it mean that she was 20 or 40 or what? One never knows. I personally never use gender columns if they exist, because you can never actually be sure. This particular entry, if I blow it up, is for John Berman. He's listed as the grandson, but his age is actually in the female column. So was he male and therefore shouldn't be John, it should be something else? Or was it the other way around, that it should actually be granddaughter? And of course, you've got to bear in mind is that with a number of, certainly celebrities, I mean, John Wayne is the classic one, whose name is actually Marion. And if anyone is of a certain age and used to watch the professional wrestling on British television many, many years ago, they may well remember a wrestler called Big Daddy, whose name was actually Shirley Crabtree. I would never want to go and argue with him. I talked earlier about quality. The quality of the image actually is one of those things that is actually going to be one of the things that is key to being able to resolve what you want to try and resolve. So that's the original image I found on Ancestry, and that's the self-same image off of the Find My Past website, both taken at the same time. So I did the two a few years ago now. And obviously, because of the way things were digitized from the original microfilms, it can be very difficult trying to get every image 100% right. And finally, we'll leave you an interesting little puzzle. This is one of those that normally when I do it, when I do this thing in a live lecture, I obviously try and get people to tell me what they think the name is. It's a very unusual one, but it's also a very unusual first letter, and it's one that often causes a lot of problems. And one of the things that I'll often do if I'm trying to transcribe something like this is I'll work backwards. So I work from the back of the word towards the front, because that can obviously give you clues. In this particular case, the last letter is an A, the one before that is a T, the one before that is an E, and the one before that, which often confuses a lot of people, is not actually an A, but is actually a U. And the U actually gives you the clue to what the first letter is, and the first letter is actually a Q. And the name, in fact, itself is Queta, Q-U-E-T-A. And Qs, in fact, often end up looking like that rather strange-looking number 2. There are lots of other peculiarities you'll find floating around the census. There's a lovely one if you want to go and have a look at it in the 1881 census. And the woman's surname, or first name rather, is actually written down as Snowbear, S-N-O-W-B-E-A-R. And in fact, we did actually manage to find her birth entry, and her name was actually Zenobia. And it's the classic example of somebody misunderstanding what she'd said. And finally, I suppose we need to think ourselves lucky that we have a centralised system, because in Canada the census is organised by province. In Australia everything is organised by state. And in fact the Australian one's even worse, because the first census they kept in fact wasn't until 2001, which won't be available until 2100. And in America, of course, you've got 50 separate states, all of which do things their own way. And I'll leave you back with Alec to go and sort out questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. Yeah, that was great. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. It certainly given me some food for thought when I go back to tackling some of the mysteries in my own research. But yeah, no, thanks for all the questions you've been putting through. You've certainly been keeping us busy. It looks like the team's got through quite a few, but there's still a few left. So I will start off with a question from Jill Lloyd. Thanks very much, Jill. And Jill has asked, can you clarify about not-at-home members of the armed forces? If they were in a barracks, would they appear on a barrack census or at their own home address?
One assumes you're talking about. Normally, what happened within an army barracks is that those, if they were in the barracks, then the barracks would be split normally into two separate pieces. So you'd have the army staff listed within the barracks, and then you have the civilian staff listed separately. If they were at home, and obviously on home leave or whatever, then they could well be with their family. But within the barracks, as I said, they will normally be listed periods and simply as a block of soldiers.
Brilliant. And so this next one here we've got is from Jill Lloyd, and I'm sorry, that's the one I've just asked. Sorry, no, I'm asking you on this time. This one's quite a mysterious one. This is from Peter Blakey, and Peter has said that he's found his grandfather appearing in the 1901 census in both Birmingham and Manchester simultaneously. How is this possible? Would it be possible?
If somebody says their ancestor appears in two places, I always get them to make sure you've got to be 100% right that it is the self-same person. If they're with other family members, then there's two possibilities. It's possible that there was a confusion. They'd filled in one form and then they'd if they've then gone off somewhere. A bit like the example I showed with my great uncle when he's listed as on the return from his grandfather with his father in 1911, and have then been crossed off and appears later on with his uncle. It could be that. It could be that the enumerator hadn't noticed it had been crossed off and put them on. If they're on their own, it's always possible, of course, that somebody's filled in at home thinking they were going to be there, and of course then they ended up living somewhere else. It depends on what he did for an occupation as well. Things like travelling salesman could obviously have been enlisted with his family and then separately. It would depend upon whether he's on his own or with the rest of the family.
Great, thanks for that. So the next one we've got is from Ken Day. Thanks very much for sending this in, Ken. And while looking in the census sheets, Ken has been coming across the abbreviation RG, and he was wondering what that stands for.
Depends upon whereabouts on the form it is and which particular census. Certainly down the bottom, if it's on the census pages and it's down the bottom, the RG reference is Registrar General and applies to the censuses from 1861 onwards. 1841 and 51 are part of the Home Office and come within HO. And you've got RG9 is 1861, 10 is 71, 11 is 81, 12 is 1901, no, 12 is 1891, 13 is 1901, and RG14 is 1911.
Lovely. So we've got another good question here from John Foster. So John's great-grandfather was a merchant seaman, and as you'd expect, he's in the 1911 census, he's obviously away at sea, because he's not listed with the other family members. Was there any source or lists printed of men like this who were known to be at sea and away from home at the time?
The simple answer to that one is no. There are no. I mean, the captain of the ship he was on would obviously have been given a copy of the return if they were going to be landing in port, normally within less than a week, because obviously of the timescales involved. If they were going to be at sea for more than a week, the odds are that they weren't even given a form in the first place. Your best bet is to try and find his merchant seaman records.
Yeah, I guess if you know the name of the ship.
If you know the name of the ship, then you might be able to find out what ship he's on and the rest of it. But no, there's no list that I'm aware of.
So you'll have to try our Merchant Navy records, John. We've got tons of them. So yeah, check those out. So the next question we've got is from Marion Woolgar. And Marion has asked, is there a comprehensive list available anywhere of all the various piece and folio numbers that are missing and lost for each census from 1841 right the way up?
One of those lovely, interesting and awkward questions. As I said earlier, the Find My Past has a list of all of the known complete pieces that are missing. To my knowledge, other than the street indexes, there is no index that I'm aware of that sort of lists part missing pages or part missing pieces. Nobody's ever compiled one, purely and simply because you only know about them when you stumble on them by chance. Having said that, I reported one to Find My Past yesterday when I found the last 3 pages of a census return hadn't been transcribed. That was from 1901, I think, when the 3 pages were missing. There's a family I've got that lived in a tiny village called Reedley Hollows just outside Burnley in Lancashire, who appeared in every census apart from 1861. And it was by looking at the statistical pages I was able to prove that, in fact, the last 4 pages of that particular census return are missing. But as far as I'm aware, nobody's ever tried to collate a list of them. Perhaps Find My Past might like to think about that as a possible addition to their website.
That's certainly something to consider, that. So the next one we've got now is from Mark Moore. Sorry, I was just picking which one to go for next. This sounds like quite a complicated one, actually. Mark has asked, are there any indices of entries where the only personal name indicator is an initial or even less?
Okay, yeah, I know what he means. know what he means. I'm assuming but what we're talking about here is the entries that purely and simply have initials. So it'll just say that it's JH rather than John Hanson. They tend to be predominantly used in institutions, normally prisons, and they will cause a bit of a problem in trying to find. I mean, I do have, in the one-name study I do, there's a lovely fellow called Folds Cronshaw that you'd expect to find because his name's so one of those lovely ones that's a bit easier to find than John Smith. Except I can't find him in the 1871 census. 1881 he's in prison in Preston in Lancashire. 1891 he's in prison down in Portsea. 71 I know he's not in prison because I've got his entire prison record, so I know he's certainly out somewhere, but I still can't find him. And in 1861 he turned up, and the only way I was able to find him was purely and simply by looking for somebody with the initials FC, born in Colne, C-O-L-N-E, place in Lancashire, except in the Enumerators Checker, had actually had gone through the census return when I looked at the image and put all the counties in because it's in a different handwriting to the original. And he put it down as being in Essex rather than in Lancashire, which is why it confused me to begin with. But the only reason I found him was purely and simply looking for an FC born in Colne. They can be difficult ones to work your way around. The one thing you can do is if you find them in an institution is to see if the institution records still survive. And in that case, because he was in prison, we were actually able to go and find his prison record.
Brilliant. And so we've got another interesting question here from Sally Gillette. So Sally has a feeling that her ancestor may have been in the workhouse at the time of the census being taken. Were workhouses included in normal returns, or would you need to look elsewhere?
No, they'll be included within the normal returns. 1911 is slightly different. There's a number of different types of return that we used within the 1911 census. I was going to say you could go and look at my book, but it's no longer in print. I'm trying to remember. There was 15 entries on the normal page. Then they did one that had a continuation, so it had about 40 entries. For the institutions, they used a special one. And the way you can normally tell an institution is because the schedule number, because it's an institution, they don't actually have schedule numbers, and the schedule number on Find My Parcel will always appear as 4 9s. So if it's an institution, then they'll normally have their own separate returns. Earlier years, they'll just appear as a great block of people all living at the same address. But they do exist. Occasionally, I think I've seen one institution somewhere that had just initials for a lot of its inmates. The other thing you often find with them is that they will list the people with their names the wrong way round. So they'll list the surname first and then the first name, because obviously that's what they've copied out of their own registers. The problem is then that occasionally the transcriber will get it wrong and you'll end up with the surname in the first name column and vice versa.
Great. So next question. Next question is from Linda Gatto. Thanks for sending this in, Linda. So Linda said at one point during the webinar, John, you said not to confuse the numbers on the left of the census as house numbers. What exactly are they? Should we assume that the enumerator is going from house to house in order to fathom out who lives there, who lives where in a village? Was this how it was done?
The first column, in fact, are the schedule numbers. So it's the schedule. When he gave the schedules out to everyone, he kept a note of what schedule number he'd given to who, so that he could then actually make sure when they got filled in at the end, he'd got every single schedule. So if he gave out 99 schedules, he would list 99 houses or 99 households as such.
Great, and this next one, actually, I'm quite interested in this because I've got shopkeeper ancestors. This one is from Neil Gardner, who's asked, do street indexes indicate whether the premises was commercial, was it a retail premises, or yeah?
The simple answer to that one is no. The other thing you need to bear in mind, and of course it's something we've not touched on within the webinar, is the fact that if you actually read, as I've done, You sit down and read the actual documentation that says what was supposed to be filled in where. What it actually said for your occupation was you were supposed to list the occupation that was your main source of income. So obviously if you had two jobs, as quite a few people did at that time, you'd list the one that you actually got your main income from. But occasionally you'll get the ones that say, yeah, I'm the farmer and the innkeeper or whatever, but they're very few and far between.
And we've got another good, this is kind of like a nice general question, this actually. This is from James Jackson. Thanks for this one, James. James has asked, so what kind of people were enumerators? What exactly was an enumerator? What kind of people were they? What did they do, really?
They covered a multitude of occupations. It's often worth checking. And enumerators, I don't think, tended to do their own area. It's not one, I must admit, I spent a lot of time researching. The one thing, there were a number of things. You had to be articulate. You had to be able to read and write, obviously. One of the things I think they didn't seem to worry too much about the state of their handwriting, looking at some of them. You wanted somebody, obviously, who was going to have a fairly clear hand, because somebody had to read it at the end of the day. So you didn't want to somebody who's going to sort of scroll the whole thing out. But they tended to often be, the clergyman, the doctor, the whatever. We could be in a shopkeeper, but basically somebody who was reasonably educated.
So, this one's from Donald Davis. Another quite nice general question. Do householders' schedules survive? And if they do, where can you find them?
As we said, the only ones that do survive are, in fact, the ones from 1911. At least that is what was always said. I did hear an interesting lecture about 2 years ago when I was out in Portugal at the Genealogy in the Sun conference, from somebody who, in fact, was a Canadian who had actually been doing some research in Shropshire Record Office. And he'd gone and got this bundle of papers out that the description didn't really say exactly what they were, and when he actually looked at it, he realised exactly what they were, and in fact they were the original schedules for 1841 for 7 villages in Shropshire, which he was then able to sit down and sort of compare the schedules against what was actually in the enumeration in the enumeration books, and it was actually quite interesting, his lecture as to and I think it highlights the fact that what we suspect has probably happened if they'd have done the books from 1911 into enumeration books rather than the schedules, in that a lot of the information that we see that was crossed out wouldn't have been copied. So it's possible that there are some around, floating around in the record office somewhere, but there's no known list of them that I'm aware of.
Right. So I reckon, I think we can squeeze two more. I think we can squeeze two more in. So the next one, it's more of a recap than a question, actually. It's from Deb Highfield, and I've actually noticed someone else asked this as well. Could you possibly quickly resum the section on suffragettes? Why exactly do you not find them in the census? Why are they missing?
It was all to do. It's all to do with the history, I suppose, of the suffragette movement and this thing that they really wanted to be recognised in their own right, rather than sort of be taken for granted, I suppose. And a lot of them at the time were sort of rebelling, and their way of rebelling was to say, I don't want my name on the schedule.
Yeah, so I think it's spoiled papers.
Yeah, spoiled papers is what you'll often end up with. I mean, it varies from household to household, and it's very difficult to be precise about what what in fact is missing. It could be that if it was a whole house of women, that it might just say, they refuse to put their names down. Yeah. Sometimes you'll find an entry from the husband that says, wife and children refuse to be named or whatever. It varies totally. I don't think there's any one sort of consistent point in it at all.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen quite a few. I've seen quite a few ones that always make me laugh, where they say, no people here, only women, which I thought was quite a good way of getting your point across. Yeah. And I've also come across a few where the husband has scribbled it out and written notes of apologies for me. Going, I'm terribly sorry about my wife. She's being a suffragette at the moment. So yeah, they're always fascinating to come across those, aren't they? And I think one final question. I'll ask this one because it's a bit of fun. And wow, it's apparently it's from Theresa May. Last week we had Jeremy Corbyn asking questions. This week we've got Theresa May. And Theresa has asked, what is your favourite census and why?
What is my favourite census? Are we talking about a specific year or a particular entry? I suppose the interesting one was the one that came up within the 1881 census, and it was stumbled across from the LDS CDs, because in fact it was actually found later on to be a complete and utter spoof that was written in on a blank page, because normally the enumerator at the end was supposed to cross all the blank pages through, and this one wasn't. It's believed that it was actually written at the National Archive by somebody, they don't know who and when. But it's interesting because and we know it was after 1947 because it lists as one of the countries Pakistan, but it lists the occupations as being the lion tamer and zookeeper and all sorts. So it's actually quite an interesting one.
Great. I think my favourite one is I've seen the youngest member of the household is a 3-year-old called Tom, and his ethnicity is Persian. His birth country is Persian, and his occupation is a mouser. Yeah. But the reason I love it so much is that in really angry capitals in red ink, the enumerator scribbled it out and gone, "This is a cat." You can always sense the annoyance. But anyway, thank you so much again, John. That was brilliant, and thank you all for tuning in and joining us. We hope you join us next time. As always, we love hearing your feedback, so get in touch either through Twitter or Facebook, or you can send an email through to testimonials@findmypast.com. Tell us what you think. Tell us if any ways you think we can improve, or subjects that you'd like to see covered in the future. Great. So, hopefully you'll be joining me again soon. Thanks again, and have a lovely week. Bye.